I am Anil Murthy, the Director of Product Management at OpenMesh, and I'm excited to introduce to you some new switch management features. Before I actually get into the demo portion of this video, I'd like to point out how you can find out about what these switch management features are. So if you go into your CloudTrex account and click on the account dropdown, you'll see that there's a What's New link, and clicking on this basically brings up a pane that has a list of notifications about things that we've introduced into CloudTrex. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Learn More link under the new switch features. And what you'll see is that this takes me to the switch firmware release notes on our help portal. And you'll notice that there's a new firmware version 1.01.01 that was released yesterday that adds support for a bunch of new switch management and configuration features. So with that, I'll jump back into CloudTrex now. To start with, let's go over to the maintenance page. There is a 101.01 image available for upgrade. So if you select this and set a maintenance window, your switches should automatically get upgraded to the latest firmware version, and you should have access to all the new switch features that we introduced today. We have introduced the concept of a switches page within the configure menu, and the intention here is any features that need to be configured across all the switches of a given network would reside inside the configure switches page. So SNMP is a feature that we've had on our switches from day one. It used to be inside the advanced configuration page. What we've done is we've moved that into the dedicated switches configuration page, and you can see that it's here now. We've added a new feature called spanning tree protocol configuration in this page here, and you can see that it's enabled on my switches here. By default, when you upgrade to version 1.01, the switches come with spanning tree protocol enabled. This is the default configuration for any switches, and if you were to factory reset any switch, it would go back to the default configuration. Further, the protocol selection is set to RSTP, and this is the default as well, but you can change it to either STP or MSTP from here. You can also choose to turn off spanning tree protocol if you wish to. So with that, I'll now jump into the manage portion of our of the CloudTrex demo. So if you click on switches, and one of the first things you'll notice is that the name of the switch is now blue in color. The reason it's blue in color is because we've changed the way you can launch the switch pane. Up until a couple of days ago, both the switch pane and the access point pane would come up regardless of where you clicked on this row here, and we've changed that to only allow bringing up the pane when it's when the user clicks on the name of the device, and this was done based on feedback we've received from several users who have complained to us that it can be a little bit of a challenge trying to copy an IP address. With that, I'm going to go ahead and click on the switch here and bring out the switch pane. To start off, I'll point out that there's a couple of tabs here. There used to be just the ports tab before, and now there's a second tab called General. The intention again is to extend the concept of making it as easy as possible to configure things on the switches of a network. So we have the concept of a configure switches page, which is used to store any configuration items that apply to all switches in the network. And then further within the switch pane, there are items that apply to the switch as a whole. Those would typically go into the general tab, and then things that need to be configured differently on every single port would end up on the ports tab. Now I'm going to go ahead and hover over the switch image here, and as I hover over these ports, you'll see that they don't look any different from what they did a couple of days ago, except until I get to a port that actually has an active link. You'll notice that there's a new option called reset. And what this reset does is essentially resets the port. And depending on whether the port happens to be just having an active link or has both PoE and link enabled, the port reset would reset both PoE and link, or just reset the link. So in this case, this port happens to be plugged into a Cisco phone that's on my desk. So if I was to hit reset on this, it would power cycle the phone, both the link as well as the PoE. If you look at the uplink port, the reset on this would just power the uplink. And so that's the reset function, and the important thing to note is that the reset function is instantaneous, so it causes the device reset immediately. Moving on to the ports configuration tab, what you'll notice is that there's a lot more things here. And so what we've done is we've made the ports grid horizontally scrollable. So you can actually scroll through this ports grid and get access to many of the new features without sacrificing the size of the columns. We've also added an element that allows you to select a given port. You'll also notice that there's a mirror and aggregate button, which are used for doing port mirroring and link aggregation. So getting into just the new features that are introduced on the port configuration portion of the switches, you'll notice that we've had allowed VLANs in the past. This is where you can specify VLANs that should be allowed and allowed to pass through the switch ports without any changes to them. And we by default configure these to be set up for the seamless roaming VLANs that our open mesh access points use. Moving to the right of that, there's a column called PVID, which stands for Port VLAN ID. And what this does is essentially whatever VLAN ID is configured in this field here gets set on the packets that are coming into that port. So it's a little bit similar to the concept of a native VLAN for people that come from the Cisco world. To the right of that is a column called Untagged VLANs. What this will do is essentially look at every packet that's leaving the port, and if it happens to be tagged with the VLAN ID that's entered in the box here, it will untag that packet before it leaves the port. The key thing to remember here is that PVID is applied to only packets coming into the port, and untagged VLANs is applied to packets leaving a given port. So if you wanted a untagged packet coming into a given port to be tagged and tagged with, let's say, PVID2 when it enters port 1, and to be untagged when it leaves port 2, you would set port 1 to a PVID of 2, and then the untagged VLANs on port 2 at VLAN ID 2, so that the packets leave port 2 without a tag. Further, you can specify more than one untagged VLAN in the list of untagged VLANs here, but you can only specify one PVID. In order for our switches to work with CloudTrax, it's very important that the traffic that goes between CloudTrax and the switches needs to be able to get to the management VLAN on the switches. By default, our switches are set with a management VLAN of VLAN ID 1, which is indicated on top here. And so it's very important that the uplink port must have the value 1 programmed in both the PVID and the untagged VLANs. So you'll notice that my uplink port happens to be port 23, and that has a 1 here and here. And so it's very important to keep those that way. If not, your switch will end up losing connection to CloudTrax. The next two fields are for being able to check status of any mirroring and link aggregation sessions that are in progress. I'll talk about how you can configure mirroring and link aggregation in a few minutes here. To the right of those fields is flow control. To enable flow control on a given port, all you got to do is just check the box here and hit save. Flow control is by default disabled on all of our switches in the firmware. So if you get a new switch and you don't configure it before plugging it in, it'll come in with flow control disabled. Further, if you were to factory reset a switch by holding a pin on the front panel, it would come back with flow control disabled. The next field here is rate limiting. This is used to limit the amount of data that can flow through a given port of a switch that can be used to limit essentially the bandwidth that's available to a given user. By default, there is no value programmed here, which means there is no rate limiting applied. Given that our switches are all gigabit Ethernet switches, the max bandwidth allowed on each port is going to be 1000 megabits by default. If you want to limit the rate on a given port, you just go ahead and enter a value here, and you can enter a value anywhere between 0 and 1000 in megabits. So for example, if I was to enter 10 over here and 20 over here, what it would do is essentially limit the amount of packets received on port 1 to a max rate of 10 megabits per second, and limit the rate at which packets can be transmitted from this port at 20 megabits per second. And you'll also notice that I can specify fractional values here. So I can do 20.5 and up to 2 decimal points. And so that's how you configure rate limiting on the switch. Just go ahead and hit save, and that would get applied. You'll notice that it actually popped up a banner there, and the reason it did that is because I also modified the PVID and untagged VLANs fields, and we just prompt the user about any changes they make to these fields to make sure they're not changing the uplink ports and taking out the management VLAN. If I was not to make those changes and I was just changing something else, I would not get that prompt. So if I was to remove the rate limiting on this and hit a save, it would just take the changes right away. So that's rate limiting. So we can do rate limiting per port, and we can do it on receive and transmit independently. So that's a lot of flexibility there. Moving back and talking about mirroring and link aggregation, these are probably my favorite features of this release. And the reason I like them so much is because they're extremely easy to configure compared to what you may have seen on other switches. If you'd like to configure mirroring, you just go ahead and select two or more ports. And you'll notice that when I don't have any ports selected, both the mirror and the aggregate button are light blue in color, which is the equivalent of being grayed out, meaning I cannot click on them. But as I start selecting a port, you'll notice when I select one port, they're still grayed out. When I select the second port, both of these buttons become enabled. As I click through more ports, you'll see that they continue to be enabled all the way up until the point that I get to over 8 ports. Once I exceed the 8 port limit, you'll notice that the aggregate button is now grayed out, but the mirror button is still active. Essentially, what that is translating to is we allow up to 8 ports to be aggregated. You can do anywhere between 2 to 8 ports when you're doing link aggregation. And you can do up to 8 ports being mirrored into one port. So you can select 9 ports to be part of a mirroring session, of which 8 are sources and one of them happens to be the destination. And that's the reason why you see that behavior there. So I'm going to select the max number of ports that we allow in a given mirroring session, which is 9. And I'm going to click on the mirror button. What you'll see now is that there is an interface here that lets me decide a couple of things. One, it lets me pick what the destination of this mirroring session should be. So as you know, in port mirroring, what you're doing is you're taking traffic from one or more ports, and you're directing it into a different port so that it can be used for network analysis or debugging certain problems. So by default, what we do is we pick the port number from the list of ports selected that has the lowest port number to be the destination port. But you're welcome to go ahead and change that, and you'll notice that it automatically reflects the source ports, automatically reflect the change that you made to the destination port. The next thing I can do from here is I can change my mind. So I can say, hey, I thought I was going to aggregate 8 ports, but now I just want to do 7, so I can unselect a port out of this list. Further, I can choose to mirror only the traffic received on a port, or only the traffic transmitted on a port or from a port, or do both. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to randomly select a few ports to be TX only here, and then a couple of ports to be both transmit and receive out of the list that I have over here. And I'm going to go ahead and click save over here, and you'll notice that right away the changes get pushed to the switch. I don't even have to hit save changes here. And what you see now is that the mirroring column provides me a status of what's going on here. What you'll notice is that all of the status indicators here have the same red color, and I'll show you shortly that when I configure a second mirroring session, it'll have a different color associated with all the ports that are part of that mirroring session. Further, what you'll notice is that one of the ports is marked as the destination. This is the port that we decided to select as the destination. And then the other ports indicate that they are being mirrored into that destination port, which happens to be port 9 in this case. It'll also tell you if a given port is only mirroring receive traffic, or only mirroring transmit traffic, or doing both. So you can quickly get an understanding of what's going on here. So that's it. I mean, that's how easy it is to configure port mirroring in our switches. What I can do from here is I can now decide to configure a second mirroring session. So I'm going to select these 2 ports here and enable mirroring on these 2. And I'm going to leave the destination port to be port 10 and the port 11 to be mirroring traffic on both transmit and receive. And I'm going to hit save. You'll notice that we have a second mirroring session in progress here now, indicated by a different color. I'm going to select a third mirroring session and create a third mirroring session by doing a save here. And then last, I'm going to select port 13 and 15 to be part of a fourth mirroring session. So now you'll see I have 4 ports in session, 4 mirroring sessions in progress, sorry. And now I'm going to attempt to do a fifth one, and you'll notice that it doesn't let me do that. So we can support up to 4 mirroring sessions and up to 8 ports per mirror session to be sources mirroring into a 9th port. So, so now you can see that the interface is extremely easy to use. There is a clear indication of what ports are part of a mirroring session and a clear distinction between different mirroring sessions by colors of the session. Now, if I want to tear down these mirroring sessions, that's extremely easy to do as well. So what I would do is I would just select a given port of a mirroring session. Let's say I want to take off port 5 and 6 out of the first mirroring session. I would just select those, and you'll notice that the mirror button is now changed into an unmirror button. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. I'm going to get prompted with a message that asks me to confirm whether I want to take port 6 and 5 out of this mirroring session. Once I do OK on that, you'll notice that now these ports are no longer being mirrored. Further, what I can do is I can also choose to select multiple ports from multiple mirroring sessions. They don't have to be all, I don't have to do them individually. So I can select, like, let's say 15, 14, and 11, which are all part of different mirroring sessions. And let's say port 8, that's part of the first mirroring session, and do an unmirror on all of these. And you'll notice that it unmirrors them all at the same time. What you also noticed is that unmirroring the other 3 sessions, unmirroring ports from the other 3 sessions caused the entire session to be torn down. And the reason that happened was because there was only 2 ports that were part of that mirroring session. And so it didn't make sense to have a session active with just 1 port. Now I'm left with just 1 mirroring session, so I'm going to go ahead and leave that one for now. Moving on to link aggregation, it's a very similar concept and how it gets configured. You just select the 2 ports that you want to aggregate together and click on the aggregate button, and it asks you to confirm that you want to aggregate these 2 together. And when you say OK over here, it shows you in the link aggregation column that these 2 are now part of a given link aggregate group. Similarly, I can pick 2 different ports. Let's say port 8 and 9, and or maybe even more than 2, 10, 11, 12, and again click aggregate here, and now you'll notice that there's a second link aggregation session in progress. And similar to the port mirroring, each of these groups are distinguished by a group number as well as a different color that's used to indicate that it's a different session. If I was to aggregate a third set of ports, you'd see that they would get a different color here. And then to take ports out of the aggregation, I can just choose to pick any number of ports here. And you'll notice that I intentionally left 1 port each out of these groups, just to show you how easy the interface is to use. You'll notice that the aggregate button is now changed to a split button. And when I click on the split, all of my aggregation groups are torn down, except group 2, because that had more than 2 links being aggregated. So if I select one of these now and do a split here, all of my aggregation groups are gone. So that's how you configure mirroring and link aggregation and tear them down. As you can see, it's we put a lot of thought into how we design our user interface and make it extremely easy to use. And we're really looking forward to your feedback about what you think about these features. I'll move on to the general tab now. What you see here is that there is an option to configure IGMP Snooping. By default, we have IGMP Snooping disabled on our switches, so that's why you see the enable button is turned off. You can choose to enable it. When you enable it, you get the option of picking whether you want to run IGMP version 2 or IGMP version 3. And once you pick the version, you can also specify which VLANs this should apply to. And this VLAN list gets populated from the list of allowed VLANs on the switch. And then the spanning tree root bridge information is displayed below this, and I'll shortly show you how you can actually configure spanning tree protocol, which is done on a network-wide basis. But essentially, the root bridge information is specific to a device, and that's the reason why we display it here. Just want to point out a couple of last things here. If you want to learn about any of these features that we just went over, you can at any time click on this link here, and that will take you to a page that talks about all of the things that we just went over in this demo. So that's about it for this demo. Thank you.